The fascination with villains in anime is undeniable. Many fans agree that the antagonists in our favorite series are often characters as captivating and profound as the heroes themselves, if not more so. In this script, we will explore the psychology of these iconic villains, their motivations, traumas, and convictions that shape their actions. We will see how these characters transcend the simple label of evil and invite us to question our own ideas about good and evil within the genre. Traditionally, the word villain conjures up the image of someone dark, cruel, and ruthless. However, modern anime often strays from this simplistic view. Unlike the Manichaean villains of yesteryear, many anime villains have rich and complex backstories. They are not evil by nature, rather, they have gone through traumatic experiences, been betrayed by society, or possessed ideals so radical that their definition of justice differs greatly from that of the heroes. In many cases, these antagonists do not see themselves as the bad guys of the story. To them, what they do is necessary, just, or even altruistic to a certain extent. This psychological complexity makes them fascinating, three-dimensional figures, forcing us to ask ourselves, who is really the villain and who is the hero? In anime, we often see villains who transcend simple morality. Their motivations can range from personal revenge and a desire to change the world to almost divine aspirations or the search for purpose after tragedy. Upon analyzing them, we discover that they often start out as victims of society, of fate, of other characters, or even of their own broken ideals. Facing these traumas transforms them and propels them down dangerous paths. Thus, the villain ceases to be a generic evil and becomes a human being with specific pain, questionable decisions, and twisted but understandable reasoning. Although each villain is unique, they often share psychological patterns that explain why they act the way they do. Among the most common motivations for complex anime villains are trauma and revenge. Many villains have suffered a profound loss or injustice in the past. That trauma drives them to seek revenge on those they consider guilty or even on society as a whole. For example, the pain of losing loved ones or betrayal by someone they trusted can instill an almost irrational hatred in them. Their desire for revenge then becomes the spark that ignites the rest of their distorted morality. Extreme ideology or twisted utopia. Some villains have a radical view of the world. They believe it is corrupt, unjust, or in need of drastic change. From there, they justify any means to achieve their noble end. For example, they seek to impose absolute peace through pain or iron-fisted control, or to reimagine reality entirely to create a perfect society, according to their own rules. Their ideology, whether utopian or pessimistic, gives them a false sense of purpose, sense of superiority or megalomania. There are those who consider themselves above the law and common morality. They see themselves as special beings, true leaders, gods, or saviors, and justify their actions by the belief that only they know what needs to be done. This conviction leads them to act with arrogance and contempt toward others. Excessive ambition or lust for power. In this case, the pursuit of power, political, magical, or personal, is the main driving force. They want more influence, resources, or abilities at any cost. Sometimes this stems from their own insecurities. They feel that only power makes them valuable or secure. Other times it is simple greed. Power itself corrupts them and makes them addicted to domination. Alienation and social resentment. Some villains feel marginalized or ignored by society. This may be due to their origins, oppressed peoples, differences in birth, etc., or experiences of extreme rejection. Resentment and not belonging makes them reject social norms. Thus, in their minds, they punish the society that ignored them by showing it the worst side of human nature. Search for meaning or survival. In certain cases, the villain acts out of pure survival instinct or an existential crisis. They may be someone who seeks purpose in an absurd world, nihilistic thinking, and decides to create it in their own way. For example, villains who want to defeat death or escape existential suffering may take paths that are atrocious from a traditional point of view. These patterns are not mutually exclusive. Very often they are combined in a single character. The crucial thing is that behind their evil deeds there is always an emotional or rational explanation that the viewer can understand, even if it does not necessarily justify their methods. Next, we will look at some iconic anime villains whose psychology has transcended simple evil, inviting us to reflect on them. In Death Note, Light Yagami is a brilliant student who, after finding a supernatural notebook, assumes the power to kill anyone whose name he writes in it. At first, his intention seems altruistic, to eliminate criminals and create a better world. However, he soon becomes embroiled in a deadly game of cat and mouse with the police and other users of the notebook. From a psychological point of view, Light is not a psychopath without a cause. He firmly believes that he is doing justice. With each lethal decision, he reaffirms that he is the only one capable of ridding the world of crime. In his mind, he becomes a god, Kira, convinced that his actions are necessary necessary to achieve good. This delusion of grandeur points to megalomania and a twisted sense of moral superiority. Light sees any innocent life as expendable in the face of his vision of an ideal world. The interesting thing is that, in his internal logic, Light is not crazy. He coldly adjusts his plans, manipulates, and lies because he believes that the end justifies the means. His psychology transcends classic good and evil. He is not pure evil, but someone dominated by his absolute ideal of justice. In the end, this makes him a fascinating character who questions whether a world without crime would really be worth it if it had to cost so many innocent lives. Lelouch, the protagonist of Code Geass, starts out more as a hero than a villain, but his evolution is fascinating. He uses the power of Geass to rebel against the Britannian Empire, with the goal of avenging his mother and freeing his sister. However, in the process, he earns the title of terrorist in the eyes of the world. His defining psychological trait is the sense of responsibility that drives him. Lelouch accepts the blame for terrible acts if it means achieving a greater good for the majority. Behind his violent actions is a young man traumatized by the loss of his mother and an almost noble desire for justice for the oppressed. Although his methods are cruel, manipulation, war, deception, Lelouch sees himself as someone willing to do the dirty work that others cannot. Unlike villains who enjoy evil, Lelouch is tormented by guilt. He constantly struggles with his conscience. In the end, his total sacrifice, even his own death, shows that for him, the greater good was worth more than his personal innocence. His psychology forces us to ask ourselves if being a villain can be a role one willingly takes on to save something valuable. In Naruto, Nagato, known as Pain, is the leader of Akatsuki who attacks the village of Konoha. But his story is tragic. During his childhood, he lived through constant wars and saw his parents and his best friend die. This continuous pain changed him profoundly. Nagato develops a philosophy about suffering. If he can spread pain in the same way he felt it, perhaps people will learn to understand each other and achieve peace. Thus, revenge and personal tragedy shape his motivation. For him, the end goal is to create world peace, a perfectly understandable desire, but the means is to impose absolute terror until everyone lives in fear. This logic leads him to inflict massive suffering. What is remarkable about Pain is that he does not act out of selfishness or personal ambition. He sincerely believes that his horrible actions will guide the world toward the light. In his mind, being a villain justifies momentarily becoming a god of pain to break the cycle of violence. The question here is disturbing. Can any ideal be achieved by such atrocious methods? Pain shows us a villain who thinks he is acting for the common good, even if the means are morally reprehensible. Also in Naruto, Madara Uchiha is a complex character whose ultimate plan is to plunge all human beings into a perfect illusory dream, the infinite Tsukuyomi, to end the suffering of war. Madara grew up as a warrior amid endless conflict, and loses both his friend and enemy for the ideal of changing the world. Disillusioned with reality, Madara develops a nihilistic philosophy. The only way to end pain is to deny reality itself. His motivation is, therefore, a twisted utopia, a desire for absolute peace at any cost. Psychologically, Madara suffers from historical trauma, past wars, death of friends, and an inflexible reasoning disorder. For him, the method of killing people's will is justified by the great end result. This villain shows how a person can drift from a longing for harmony to atrocious plans when they lose faith in real solutions. He pushes us to debate the morality of imposing happiness. Is peace worth more than freedom of conscience? Sosuke Aizen, from Bleach, is one of the most enigmatic villains. At first glance, he is a quiet officer of the Soul Society who suddenly betrays everyone to break the rules between the world of the living and the afterlife. Why? Aizen is obsessed with discovering the true reality. He believes that life is plagued by artificially imposed limits, world forms, death, human capacity. Psychologically, Aizen exhibits an inflated ego and intellectual nihilism. He does not seek revenge or power for himself. He seeks to know the ultimate meaning of existence. He believes that only he has the mind capable of overcoming the illusion of the current world. Thus, his actions, though ruthless, are like experiments to him. Aizen feels no real guilt for the lives he ruins. To him, individuals are pieces in his philosophical game. This unshakable ego makes him a terrifying villain. His ambition is not earthly, but transcendental. It makes us wonder what happens when someone with great intelligence and philosophical vision decides to play God, and it makes us reflect on the ethical limits of scientific curiosity. In One Piece, Don Quixote Doflamingo is a violent and charismatic pirate king. His story reveals a painful background. He was born into the world's nobility, but was humiliated when his family fell from grace. He grew up believing that the world is inherently unfair, where only the strong survive. His psychology combines trauma, resentment, and sadistic amusement. Doflamingo delights in causing chaos because, in his mind, it is natural law. He survived humiliation and betrayal. Others must fear and revere him. He has constructed a distorted code in which he himself is the king of the underworld who dispenses justice as he sees fit. He does not aspire to change the world for the better, but to dominate and reorder it in his own image. Through him, we see how personal suffering can transform someone into a power-hungry person who, in some cases, even enjoys inflicting suffering on others. Eren Yeager is an interesting case because he starts out as a hero and ends up questioning those labels. In Shingeki no Kyojin, Attack on Titan, Eren decides to wipe out almost all of humanity to free his people from the external threat. His transformation is the result of extreme experiences of war and manipulation of his power. Psychologically, Eren develops a visceral hatred and absolute hopelessness. He believes that the only way to guarantee the future of his people is to eliminate the human threat at its root. He convinces himself that he is doing the right thing to protect his friends and family, even if it means committing genocide. In his mind, it is a battle for survival. What is remarkable is that Eren never considers himself a villain. For him, it is simply a large-scale war. His case confronts us with difficult questions. To what extent can violence be justified in the name of freedom? Eren breaks the line between hero and villain and forces us to reconsider whether a character can be both victim and executioner at the same time. Meruem is the king of the Chimera Ants in Hunter x Hunter. At birth, he is a ruthless being without empathy, designed to dominate. At first, Meruem is the quintessential villain. He kills humans with impunity because he sees them as food or insects. However, his encounter with the professional player Komugi awakens something in him. He begins to experience curiosity, vulnerability, and even love. This psychological evolution shows a brutal contrast, from being a killing machine with no moral conscience to questioning the value of human life and compassion. Meruem discovers the dilemma between his genetic nature as a monster and the emotions he now feels. Towards the end, he sacrifices himself to protect Komugi, proving that he has attained a moral code of his own. Meruem presents us with a villain who literally learns what it means to be human through contact with kindness, inviting us to reconsider whether evil is innate or a choice. Tomura Shigaraki, the main antagonist of My Hero Academia, is a young villain with a painful background. Abandoned and disturbed since childhood, he experienced social rejection and grew up with a phobia of heroes. His destructive quirk, power, and the influence of the former villain all for one turned him into a nihilist. His initial motivation is contempt and resentment. Shigaraki feels that the Society of Heroes has robbed him of his childhood and happiness. He believes that the system is corrupt and that the heroes themselves are hypocrites. Therefore, he seeks to destroy that society, starting anarchy in order to rebirth everything. Although he seems chaotic, behind his brutality is a young man who acts out of the pain of abandonment and repressed anger. Over time, his clash with a hero, Midoriya, raises questions about his path, showing that his psychology is not static. Shigaraki exemplifies how a wounded soul can become the fearsome antagonist he always wanted to destroy, forcing us to see that the line between victim and aggressor can be very thin. When we analyze these stories, another interesting aspect emerges. Villains often reflect the shadows of heroes or society in general. Many villains possess abilities, powers, or characteristics similar to those of the protagonist, but they use them under diametrically opposed principles. For example, one could say that Light Yagami is the protagonist of his own story, where he is the hero of his world, massacring criminals, while Officer L is the villain. In this way, anime presents us with antagonists who are anti-heroes from their own perspective. In addition, many villains shed light on real social flaws, corruption, injustice, discrimination, and other problems. They make the hero, and therefore the viewer, question whether current institutions or ideals are failing. For example, a villain may reflect the hypocrisy of an authoritarian government or the cruelty of a competitive school system. By confronting heroes with these painful truths, they force both character and audience to reevaluate their beliefs. In short, the transcendental villain serves as a provoker of moral introspection, almost as important as the hero. Anime villains, then, are less absolute villains and more tragic anti-heroes or chaotic leaders with their own logic. They remind us that concepts of good and evil can be subjective and are influenced by each person's personal experiences. By understanding their psychology, we understand that anime encourages us to look beyond appearances. After analyzing these stories, it becomes clear that in anime, the villain is not simply someone we should hate without question. These characters show us that every evil action can have painful roots or corrupted ideals. They invite us to ask ourselves, what would we do in their shoes? Can we condemn them without understanding their suffering or their convictions? The line between good and evil becomes blurred when we understand the reasons behind each decision. A villain could be a fallen hero, a failed redeemer, or a misunderstood idealist. In many cases, what separates a hero from a villain is not their capacity for harm, but their willingness to justify themselves and to the world. Ultimately, the psychology of these villains shows us that morality in anime is a distorted mirror that reflects human complexity. It challenges us to feel empathy even for those who commit terrible acts and to recognize that no one is born exclusively good or evil. Every story of villainy is a glimpse into the hidden side of a human being. In the end, after seeing their motivations and dilemmas, we are left reflecting on what is really good and evil in a world of grays, where intention and perception are as important as the action itself.